The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall, and it's coming to you on a very sad week for us here at AE 9/11 Truth. We have lost our friend and an important member of our 9/11 Truth family, Mr. Allan Rees. Now, if you're not familiar with who he is, it's probably because he did not seek the limelight at all. He preferred to be behind the scenes most of the time, but he is the guy behind No Lies Radio, and that is the network where this very show found its home so long ago, back in 2012. Now, we were on some other network before that for a very brief amount of time. It was a shortwave radio station. We couldn't afford to stay there. It cost money every single week. And Allan opened his doors and welcomed the show in because he believed in what we were doing. He believed in AE 9/11 Truth. And this is the story not just for 9/11 Freefall, but for so many other radio hosts who found a home on his network. It's a very sad thing for us, too, because he was our tech guy as well. So we had a lot of interaction with him. If a computer went down or there was some kind of issue, the wrong cables were put in the wrong place or whatever, first thing we said was call Allan. And Allan was always able to fix it. And he was always a pleasure to work with, very easy to deal with, which is not the case with a lot of people out there, but just a very calm, cool, collective guy. And as well, too, he's the guy that was the media person for many here in the 9/11 Truth movement, like getting behind the live streams if we needed to do one somewhere, or even just doing this show when it went to video. He was the guy that set us up. And I can remember a couple of years ago, I had to step in and MC a live 9/11 anniversary event. It was like a last minute thing. You guys probably know the circumstances, but I was not ready for this because I had never run the technical stuff. I didn't know how to operate the StreamYard. I was just so scared that something was going to go wrong. I was going to hit the wrong button and screw up the whole broadcast. And it was a pretty important anniversary too. So I was a nervous wreck. Well, Allan sat down with me a few days before and just straightened me right out. And by the end, I was confident that we could run this off without a hitch. And indeed, it went just fine. And I have Allan to thank for that. He was a great mentor when it came to things like this. Not just for me, but for so many people here in this cause as well. And you're going to be hearing this tonight. Allan was also a journalist at times. He did the interview with Sunder back in 2008, right after the World Trade Center 7 report was issued. And I made sure to put this in the description for the show tonight. It was one of those rare moments of direct dialogue between NIST and the 9/11 Truth movement. It's still cited and looked at by researchers and activists today. And if you followed us up to this point, you know that NIST doesn't really talk to us anymore. So this was like an eclipse in our world. And Allan is the one you have to thank for that. Sunder sat down and talked with Allan for that time. And then I had the pleasure of interviewing Allan in 2016 and getting more of his personal story back when this show was just audio too. So what we're going to do tonight to honor Allan's memory, very low key, but we're going to be playing those two audios for you. The first one, again, is going to be Allan's interview with Sunder right after the Building 7 report was issued. The second one is going to be my interview with Allan back in 2016, so he can tell more of his story, and I believe he also talked about this interview. So just a very important person here, and he will be missed, but never forgotten. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you knew Allan, please leave your memories of him in the comments under the video there, and let us know, how he was able to affect your life and your activism as we all work in this collective effort. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and play those audios for you right now.
On Thursday, August 21st, 2008, No Lies Radio brought you live coverage of the NIST World Trade Tower No. 7 final report on its collapse. And we also brought you live the same day, right afterwards, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth's Counter News Conference, which explained how the NIST report was in error. On that day, No Lies Radio was granted an exclusive interview with Dr. Sunder, who presented the NIST report in the news conference and who was also the lead investigator in the World Trade Tower Center disasters. You do not want to miss this interview. It follows right now. We're pleased that you've consented to this interview. We're a Pacifica Radio Network affiliate station based in Northern California, and we carried your news conference live this morning.
Okay.
And
that's wonderful.
Just for the benefit of our audience, I'm going to tell them that they may not have heard it, that you presented the National Institute and Standards of Technology NIST report for the reasons of the collapse of the World Trade Center Building No. 7 on September 11th, 2001.
Yeah.
And also for the benefit of our audience, World Trade Tower No. 7 was a 47-story building that fell nearly 7 hours after the World Trade Tower Centers collapsed, and it was not hit by an airplane. Your website states that your report on the World Trade Tower Center's collapse for No. 7 was completed over a 3-year period, and it presents the probable collapse sequence for the buildings and provides recommendations, of course. It also states that you're the director of the Building and Fire Research Laboratory, and you're the lead investigator for the Federal Building and Fire Safety Investigation into the World Trade Center disasters, that you oversee NIST activities as the lead agency for the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, and that you co-chair the National Science and Technologies Council Subcommittee on Building Technology. Did I get all that right?
That's very accurate and comprehensive.
Cool. Could you please tell our listening audience what your doctorate is in, how long have you been with NIST, and how did you happen to become the lead investigator in the World Trade Tower disaster?
Well, my doctorate is in structural engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and that goes back to 1981. And I was on the faculty of MIT Civil Engineering Department from 1981 through 1994, at which point I joined NIST in the Building and Fire Research Laboratory as a manager for work on high-performance construction materials. And over time, I became chief of the Structures Division at NIST. This is a division that does research on structures that leads to improved building codes and standards and practices. And of course, in the past, has conducted investigations of many key failures and building collapses that we've seen in this country, including the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse in Kansas City in the early 80s. Okay. And of course, my staff here and I have had published extensively in our areas of expertise.
Okay. And so then how did you become the lead investigator for the WTC disasters?
Well, when 9/11 happened, I was the chief of the Structures Division, and clearly as an expert in the field and as the experts in the entire professional community in the country, we were really concerned we wanted to get to understanding why and how these buildings collapsed, whether the loss of life was high or low, and we wanted to understand if there are any lessons to be derived in terms of improvements to building safety and codes and standards for the future. Now, clearly recognizing that what happened on 9/11 was triggered by terrorist attacks, and these were not normal events for which we designed buildings. nor that we should be designing buildings for such terrorist attacks, because that would be incredibly cost prohibitive. So, as chief of the structures division, I and my colleagues here at NIST were in close touch with the professional community, and it became very clear in the initial months that there was a study that was ongoing, funded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency under the leadership of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and it became clear among the experts working on that study that a more comprehensive and thorough investigation was needed. At the same time, we had families of the victims who had lost loved ones on 9/11 who wanted to really understand the same questions that the technical community wanted answered. And of course, they wanted to know if there was anything wrong in the building construction, if the buildings themselves were not adequately performing on 9/11. And as a result of that interest, the Congress, through its House Committee on Science and Technology, held hearings in the spring of 2002, and the end of that did three things. One, it directed NIST to conduct an investigation. Two, it actually appropriated $16 million of one-time supplemental funding for our laboratory to carry out that investigation. And third, they actually passed a new law that gives us the authority, a more comprehensive authority, to carry out these kind of building and fire safety investigations.
Oh,
that's how we got started.
That's great. Okay, now, we have a lot of listeners, that you would believe in the conspiracy theory, okay, that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolition.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm not going to pull any punches. I'm going to ask you some straight-out questions, and I hope you'll answer me.
I'll answer them to the best of my ability.
Very good. Now, I've been told that, and actually I have citations for this, but Mark Lazoe, president of Controlled Demolition, who was hired for the Building 7 cleanup. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Okay. He is quoted as saying that molten steel was found at World Trade Tower number 7. Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer, stated on October 5th, 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. Fire department personnel were recorded on video reporting seeing molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava from a volcano. Joe O'Toole, a Bronx firefighter, saw a crane lifting a steel beam vertically from deep within the pile. He said it was dripping from molten steel. Bart Borzonger, an architect who is saving relics from the rubble, stated that he found a multi-ton meteorite that was a fused element of molten steel and concrete. Now, in your investigation, did you interview Mark Lazoe, Leslie Robertson, Joe O'Toole regarding their eyewitness testimony of molten steel?
Well, by the way, we definitely talked to Mark Lazoe and Leslie Robertson over the course of this investigation. But most importantly, there's a big difference between finding molten steel in the pile, in the rubble pile, between that and finding and extrapolating that to say that the steel, when the building was still standing and the fires were occurring in the building, that in fact the steel was melting. There's a big difference for one very simple reason. Fires when in the buildings when they were standing were actually for the most part, due to the office furnishings in that building. And the temperatures to which office furnishings get to is normally on the order of about 1100 degrees Celsius. Steel melts at about 16 or 1700 degrees Celsius. So the steel, when the building was still standing, whether it's office furnishings burning or even hydrocarbon burning, which would be the jet fuel, the average air temperatures would not exceed around 11 or 1200 degrees, which is substantially less than the temperatures required to melt steel. However, when you go to the bottom of the building after the buildings have collapsed and you have shielding of the fires due to the rubble pile on top of it, the radiation is contained within the shielded region, and therefore the temperatures can exceed that what you would see in an acid fire or a hydrocarbon fire when the buildings were standing and the windows were broken or there was gas from the airplane, so it's a well-ventilated fire. So in the case of a shielded fire, it is entirely possible, when the steel was in the rubble pile itself, that parts of the steel could have melted.
Okay.
But a large,
you're not denying that there was melted steel then?
Well, in the rubble pile, there certainly could have been melted steel, but that doesn't. But the bulk of the steel samples that we got, and we had over 200 major pieces of steel, particularly from the towers, and we were able to identify several of them in the direct impact region of the airplane impact in Building 1. That we did not see any evidence of any molten steel on those particular elements that we have here on our campus.
So you found no molten steel on the evidence samples that you have. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, but back to my original question. Did you interview these witnesses who saw molten steel?
Yes, we have talked to lots of people, eyewitnesses, including, as I said, Les Robertson and Mark Lazo.
Did you take their statements about molten steel?
Well, we did not carry out this is a technical investigation. It's not a criminal investigation.
Well, that has nothing to do with crime. I'm not saying who did this. It's molten steel. It's evidence as to what happened.
Yeah, and of course we asked for information. We talked to witnesses. We have talked to over 500 over 100 first responders from the Fire Department of New York, the Police Department, the Port Authority Police Department, the Emergency Response Teams. We've talked to we have conducted over 1,000 interviews of surviving occupants. And some of these interviews, many of these interviews have exceeded 2 or 3 hours apiece, particularly those with the first responders or the emergency responders and the face-to-face interviews that we carried out with surviving occupants.
Are all those interviews public record? Are they within the record?
The findings of all of those interviews have been summarized in our reports and have been made public.
How about the actual interviews?
The actual interviews have had non-disclosure agreements because that was the conditions under which institutional review board conditions, or when you have human subjects being interviewed, the scientific basis for doing them is you have to give them the opportunity for anonymity as part of their interview process. Now,
do you know whether Mark Lazo or Leslie Robertson or Joe O'Toole were interviewed as to molten steel?
Well, as I said, there is no evidence that there was steel molten in the building when it was standing. There's no way that you could have had molten steel in the building when it was standing. And if you're alluding to the molten metal that was seen on the northeast corner of the 82nd or 81st floor of Tower 2 some minutes before the building collapsed, that was an isolated incident where molten material, not molten steel, molten material was seen coming out. It was a silverish color molten material. Okay. And so this is the same floor where the airplane crashed into the building. Yeah. Airplanes are made of aluminum, and of course you also know that the skin of the World Trade Center towers was made of aluminum.
Okay. So let's get back to the molten steel in the pile, though. Now you're saying that the fact that it was in the pile could have heated the temperatures up. Now I've talked to physicists and told me that actually violates the laws of physics, that it can't heat up because there's no source for the energy.
We disagree. I think you need to talk to experts who do this for a living.
Okay. All right. Next question. Last year, physicist Stephen Jones and 2 other physicists and a geologist analyzed the slag at the end of the beams, and they found iron, aluminum, sulfur, manganese, and fluorine, the chemical evidence for thermate, a high-tech incendiary cutting charge used by the military. The byproduct of thermite is molten iron. Now, did you, in your investigation, did you interview these physicists or examine their evidence and findings?
No, we did not.
Why not?
And for a very simple reason. We looked at all of the alternative hypotheses that were being presented. We looked at so we considered all of the possible hypotheses, and then we made a technical judgment in terms of what would actually be a credible hypothesis. And among the credible hypotheses we identified were the diesel fuel that was stored to power up the emergency generators in the building, the transfer elements, transfer trusses, girders, and overhangs that were in the building because the office building was built on top of an electric substation. And third, we wanted to look at hypothetical blast events because there was some suggestion, though we had not seen any evidence of it, that the manner in which Building 7 seemed to collapse was similar in some features to a controlled demolition. Beyond that, we looked at clearly the information about alternative theories beyond these 3 or 4 that I just mentioned, and did not feel that any of them were credible enough in our technical judgment.
Okay, now, National Fire Protection Association, NFPA 921, Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, dictates in a fire investigation that certain residues be tested for. Shouldn't you have tested those residues that Stephen Jones has found, according to your own dictates?
No. As I said before, the process we followed was very systematic. We looked at possible hypotheses. We decided technically what would muster to be a credible hypothesis, and then we proceeded to investigate those credible hypotheses more in detail. The hypotheses that we deemed not to be credible, we decided were hypotheses that needed way more information to be even feasible. They are not even feasible. Just because thermite or thermate exists in some dust particles does not necessarily translate into thermate being the cause of the building failure. There's no theory around it. There's just observations, isolated observations.
Okay. Now, the World Trade Center 7 catastrophic structural failure, according to a lot of people, shows every characteristic of a controlled demolition. Now, there were first responders who reported explosions occurring about a second before the collapse, and there was a symmetrical near freefall.
When was the
collapse? Through the path of greatest resistance. So, how could a building fall through itself through the path of greatest resistance? Doesn't that violate one of the 5th grade laws of physics that I learned? And that would also require that all the columns would have to be cut within a fraction of a second of each other. And how could your fire theory cut all the columns within a second of each other in order for the building to fall down in a free fall speed? And then there is expert testimony from demolition experts that they believe it's a controlled demolition. Did you interview any of these people?
Well, what you said right now, the 4 or 5 things that you said in quick succession without even allowing me to answer clarify your question.
Go right ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
Which you interrupted my asking a clarification.
Go ahead.
Let me just say that those things, what you just said, the collection of things you said, do not add up to a theory. They add up to simply pure and simple speculation.
Okay. Now, what about the video and the audio footage and eyewitnesses to the fact that there was foreknowledge that the World Trade Tower number 7 was going to collapse? Firefighters and emergency response personnel were overheard giving an actual countdown just prior to the time the building collapsed. The BBC reported the collapse 20 minutes prior to the collapse. Did you interview any of these response personnel and take their testimony? Did you interview the BBC? How they could have known the building was going to collapse?
We are aware that an engineer or a technical expert or a technical advisor was providing advice to the city agencies with regard to the condition of Building 7. The advice really was focused on whether or not firefighting operations should be continued in Building 7, given the fact that by this time over 400 first responders had already died on ground zero due to the collapse of the towers, and whatever remaining resources were there were being directed to other buildings where fires were ongoing. So it was the judgment of this advisor or advisors that the buildings eventually would come down because of what they were observing in terms of the fires in the building and the creaking noises that they heard. And that is entirely consistent with the damaging of connections and buckling of beams in the floor system. This decision to stop firefighting operations in Building 7 was made around around 2:30, somewhere in that time frame. And beyond that time frame, there was no firefighting operations anywhere near that building. And of course, the building eventually did collapse at 5:20. So clearly there was some advice that was given, and that is entirely appropriate for advice to be obtained by city agencies to make decisions that are life and death for their employees.
I can understand that. Can you identify that personnel? That person?
Well, again, that is not, the identification of persons and personnel is not really the issue. When we talk about our findings, we're talking about pretty credible people who have talked to us, pretty credible evidence we have, and are documented in our report. So you're going to have to read our report.
Well, we'll definitely read the report.
Yeah.
Okay, and now one more question here. Larry Silverstein, the lesser of the all three World Trade Center buildings, carried a multi-billion-dollar insurance policy in all three World Trade Center buildings, which was just purchased only months prior to their collapse. And he was shown on TV stating that he and the fire department decided to pull building number 7, and then the building collapsed. Pull is an industry term for controlled demolition. Did you interview Mr. Silverstein or the personnel in the fire department who decided to pull building 7?
Well, let me again explain to you the charter of our investigation. And maybe you asked me this question before, or maybe you did not. We are chartered by Congress to determine why and how the buildings collapsed. We're chartered by Congress to determine whether the loss of life was high or low. We're chartered, really, the purpose behind our investigations is not to find blame, but it's on fact-finding to improve building safety in this country. And our focus really is on nothing more than the technical aspects of what happened on 9/11. And what we have done is relied as technical experts, and as we all believe in the science field, our main focus is to base our findings on sound science. To the extent that we have sound science or statistically relevant interviews, that makes sense. But just anecdotally talking to individuals is not the basis on which we derive robust scientific-based findings.
So you did not interview Mr. Silverstein then?
We do not have to or need to interview folks who had anecdotal information. We relied more on the hard evidence in terms of photos, videos, design drawings, and other design documents that we have.
Okay. All right. One final question here. There's over 400 architects and engineers that put their reputation on the line in opposing your report. Why would they do this? Would you allow your expert staff and their experts to collaborate on the evidence that you have found and the evidence that they have found, or to perhaps hold a public discussion on TV?
Yeah, we really do not think that would be productive. We have, at this moment, a public comment process.
Okay.
Our public comment, the reports are on our website. They can be downloaded, and the public comment process will close at noon on September 15th.
I understand.
And, of course, we will look at the public comments and determine whether or not any changes need to be made to our findings and recommendations based on those public comments.
So you're still open to changes based on the public comments, is that correct?
We are formally going through a public comment period.
And after the public comment period is over, I guess your investigation ceases, is that correct?
After our public comment period is over, the investigation is complete, and of course, our work is not complete. We will be, by statute, required to promote the adoption of our recommendations in practice for future building codes and standards.
Okay, and then once it's complete,
and of course, we also have a statutory research role, and we'll be carrying out that research role as well.
Okay. Now, I have friends who work in high-rise buildings, and according to what I heard this morning, it seems like very small fires in buildings can cause their total and complete collapse in a matter of 10 seconds. So would you recommend to the American public, if there's any kind of fire in a high-rise building, they should get out of that building in 10 seconds?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
That's not exactly what we said in our report. What we said in our report was that these were not minute fires. They were substantial fires, uncontrolled building fires on 6 floors that persisted for close to 7 hours.
Okay, should firefighters fight these fires in the future because the buildings could collapse? Let's say they got a building in San Francisco with 7 floors engaged. Should they allow the building to be engulfed and collapse, or should they go in there and fight it?
Well, as we said in our report, one of the most important things we could do to prevent this collapse would have been is the fact that if the sprinkler system had the water supply from the city mains, and the city mains had been cut off because the collapse of the towers damaged them. So had the city mains still supplied water to the sprinkler system in the bottom half of the buildings, those buildings would likely have still be standing today.
But I was told the sprinklers were working at the top because it had its own separate water supply.
Yeah, the top of the building had according to the building code, and both the top and the bottom were consistent with the New York City building code. In the top of the building, you had the primary water supply from the overhead tanks and the secondary water supply from the city main. In the bottom half of the building, the primary water supply was from the city main, and the secondary water supply was actually from the city main but pumped using fire pumps. So that is consistent with what the New York City building code requires. Now, obviously, we have made a recommendation where we feel that it's important to increase the reliability of sprinkler systems by ensuring that the primary and the secondary water supply sources are not the same.
Okay, I understand. And would you, I guess this would be my final question since you brought up the sprinklers. Were the sprinklers operating in the top of the building in Building 7?
From the fact that many of the fires in the top floors, floors 20 and above, there were a total of 10 floors and fires, of which I said 6 were in the lower floors. Of the 4 others, probably 3 were in the 20 and higher range. Those fires were actually put out over time. We didn't see much of any fires after about mid-afternoon. And the only conclusion we can draw, there are probably twofold. One, that the fires somehow extinguished themselves by themselves, and 2, that the sprinkler systems provided water to them and put them out.
Okay, so it's a good possibility that the sprinklers did put them out.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, and I want to thank you for this interview, and I think our listeners will be quite interested in hearing what you had to say from your point of view. And I hope that maybe we can do this again in the future at some point, maybe after your findings are out, and discuss this thing further.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Allan Rees is one of the founders of No Lies Radio, an internet radio station which is an affiliate of the Pacifica Radio Network, which includes KPFA in Berkeley and WBAI in New York City. Back in 2008, he had the chance to interview Sunder, who headed up NIST's investigation of the World Trade Center disasters. I played that interview for you last week. Well, tonight me and Allan will be talking about that. So, Allan, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I can't believe it's taken me this long to get you on the show. Allan, again, is one of the head guys here at the network, and so graciously lets me use his airwaves to bring this show to you. And it's great to finally have you on to talk about some of the great work that you have done throughout the years, one of the unsung heroes of 9/11 Truth. And I didn't even really know about this interview until last week around. And I'm very happy that I got to listen to that and critique some of Sunder's responses. Again, that's in the archive, which you can find at No Lies Radio. I'm also going to be having it up on YouTube by the time this program airs. But before we get into all of that with 9/11, Sunder, your current work with the station, please tell us about yourself, your background, what led you to this kind of thinking and this kind of life as an activist.
Absolutely. Before we start, though, I'm going to give a little bit of disclaimer. I'm speaking as an individual for myself, not for No Lies Radio. No Lies Radio is actually a 501c3 foundation, so all the opinions that are expressed by me are my own, not the foundation. My background. Early on, I got involved in distrusting the government. My brother took me to, I think this is like in the middle 60s, my brother took me to a Mark Lane conference speech in San Francisco, where Mark Lane was one of the early investigators of the JFK assassination and debunked the JFK assassination. Ever since then, I think that probably it was my brother's fault, I tell him, that I've always been suspicious of government official stories. During high school, was during the Vietnam War. I started a newspaper actually in high school that was the anti-Vietnam War, and did speeches during the lunch hour and to a very hostile crowd that, most of the people in the crowd ended up being drafted or went to the Vietnam War. But I was speaking against the Vietnam War. And then I went to UC Berkeley and were involved in the demonstrations and also watched the free speech movement. So very early on, I was involved in these types of activities.
Well, we have your brother to thank. I think a lot of us have a lot to thank our older siblings for in making us who we are, a pretty big influence on us growing up, because a lot of times we try to model them, and the fact that he took you to this speech and it influenced you. A lot of people were woken up by the JFK issue and talking about this for years and years, and then 9/11 just happened, and they were ready to transition and look at all the lies and distortions that we were being asked to swallow in the wake of the official reports and the official story in the post-9/11 world, which a lot of the shows here on No Lies Radio focuses on, the consequences of this big lie that we solely focus on here on this show. So, moving forward with 9/11, how did you wake up to the issue of the controlled demolition evidence, and what prompted you to put this as one of your important personal platforms to get involved in?
Well, that happened in around the year 2006, 2007. At that time, I wasn't really really cognizant of everything that was going on. And my 86-year-old stepdad, who lived in San Francisco, turned me on to it. He had read David Gray Riffin's books, and he was talking about this, and then I got a copy of Loose Change and watched that, and after that, it was all downhill from there.
That's amazing. That's one of the first movies that came out. I remember watching that too around that time, and it took me a little bit more. I don't want to say it was a complete paradigm shift. I realized bad things happen in government. This seemed to be taking an extra step towards that dark side for me, that I wanted to have some more information under me. And just like you too, looking into all the stuff obviously you knew about by the time you interviewed Sunder in 2008, when a lot of our audience was still asleep, still rubbing their eyes from the post 9/11 official lie slumber. You were right there with a lot of the facts, involved with AE 9/11 Truth, covering their counter press conference when NIST did its little technical briefing. So, and I want to get to that, but there was also this foundation, No Lies Radio, something that had been created beforehand, obviously, and I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about the foundation of No Lies Radio or how it was founded. I should, so please illuminate me and our audience. How did No Lies Radio get started? How did you get involved with it?
Well, we got involved in that primarily because of the Iraq War. The Iraq War was just so full of lies that we wanted to do something that would, broadcast as to what was going on, and to create an alternative media that would actually tell the truth. That's why it's called No Lies Radio, and give a voice to people that are not in the mainstream media. The original idea was and still is to grow this media into something that can be a real alternative to the mainstream media.
And we have a lot of that stuff now, folks, but at that time, and I remember it, I remember when the Dixie Chicks were being demonized in the media for speaking out against the Iraq War, when other people were being singled out for simply talking about this. Not to mention 9/11 Truth. Good God. I mean, that took years for that to even start to be more openly questioned. We're not even fully there yet, but that took a lot of courage and to start an entire radio station. At that time period, it took a lot of guts and a lot of ambition to get something like that off the ground, especially at a time when there wasn't a lot of technology available to do that with, or not as simple. It wasn't as simple at that time as it is now, I think, in terms of being able to reach a lot of people. The user-created content sites like YouTube and all of that weren't as heavily available as they are now. What kind of challenges did you face in getting this network going in the beginning?
Well, I mean, it wasn't really that hard. I had to learn a lot of things. My background is IT technical stuff, so I was able to do all the technical stuff myself. Probably wouldn't have been able to do it if I had not been able to do that. It would have been cost prohibitive. And we wanted to create a foundation so that it would, be more legitimate. It was just not something that was going to be personal. It was something that would grow and end up doing other things besides the media aspect, which I'll talk about later. One of the things that did happen was that during the same time period that I started the radio, I started going to the Northern California 9/11 Truth Alliance meetings in Oakland, and Richard Gage was a member of that group too. And I got to know Richard and actually helped him with some of his computer network. And one thing led to another. When we knew that NIST was going to come out with their cover-up story of Building 7, I proposed to Richard that we do a counter news conference and broadcast it on the air right after NIST's news conference. So the proposal was that we would broadcast the NIST news conference, and then immediately after, we would do a counter news conference with Richard and some of the other people in the 9/11 Truth movement. And that's exactly what happened. And it was actually a pretty good success.
Now, how difficult was that to coordinate? Because I'm not really familiar with how long people in the general public outside of NIST were able to preview, or how long before their technical briefing they were able to preview the final report. I understand that there had been draft reports sent out and you could get a general sense of what they were going to say, but had there been a long time to be able to read essentially what their final word was going to be?
No, I don't think so, but that's probably a question for Richard to ask Richard about. We went in, at least I went into the whole thing cold and didn't know anything about what NIST was going to say. Other than it was possibly they were going to cover up the whole thing. And now, how did I get to the talk with Cheyenne Sunder? Well, after we did the news conference, then I had the idea, well, we should just do one more thing. We should actually interview Sunder and get his story. So I called up NIST and made an appointment to talk to him, and they agreed to it. So that afternoon, I got on the phone with him and did the interview, which you all heard.
Right. Geez, maybe we ought to try that here at 9/11 Freefall. Give NIST a call and see if they're willing to come on. I think that's the smartest thing to do. A lot of times people look at the people on the other side as being untouchable, and they don't realize that sometimes you can just reach out and pick up the phone and have conversations, and I encourage that. We should be talking to the people that oppose us. We should be doing it politely. You were very polite in that interview with Mr. Sunder, and, you asked the tough questions. You asked the questions a lot of us were asking at the time. There's a couple more of them that we could add to it. But that was the way to handle it. It wasn't confrontational to the point where it was rude. But he has to answer questions about this report that so many people are opposing. So many people at that time, just hundreds. Now we've got 25,000 over that. Not 25,000, but 2,500 over that have put their name to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth and want a new investigation. So that list is growing. And as you asked Mr. Sunder during it, why would they do this? Why would they oppose it?
Yeah, that was that's how the interview was that our radio station has a lot of listeners who believe that the 9/11 story was false, and I put that to him at front. And then he went ahead and answered. And I think Sunder was Dr. Sunder was open to that at the time, because I think he knew during the news conference there were a lot of people in the 9/11 Truth movement there that were questioning it. And I think he wanted to get his story out and try to counter the best way he could to questions from the 9/11 Truth community, and I think that's why he accepted the interview.
Well, and that's good of him to do that. Unfortunately, I wasn't very happy with some of his responses. You did a great job interviewing him, but I think that some of those responses were pretty subpar, and there was even some falsities, so we're going to get into that. But before we even do, what was your initial reaction to that technical briefing as you listened to it, as you listened to David Chandler essentially embarrass them and cause them to have to admit the free fall, and then the other questions? How did you feel listening to NIST, and what was your immediate reaction personally to what you were hearing that day?
My reaction was that if we let them get away without doing the counter news conference and an interview, then they would get away with it. So that's why we did all of that. So all of that was sort of spontaneous. I think it was the same day that we proposed the counter news conference. And then put it together. It was all done with a conference call, like you're doing your recordings now.
Right, and that's a pretty useful technology to be able to interview people. And we're actually going to be upping our technology here at 9/11 Freefall pretty soon, so keep an eye out for that. But it's a good way to get started. And anybody wants to know how to do this, simplest way is to get a free conference call line and use that as a good platform. So we're going to get to this interview now. First of all, I already asked you how you managed to get the interview, and he knew about the nature of the programming because you said before that you had told him there was a lot of listeners that questioned the official story, so he can't say he was blindsided. We're going to go point by point through what he said during this interview. Give me your reaction in the very beginning when he claims that the steel melted because the fires were covered, that somehow this made the fires hotter. Now, we're going to qualify this with the fact that neither you or me are physicists. We're not scientists. I did talk to somebody about this, however, who is a physicist. I won't say the name right now. But we'll qualify that, but we'll just give your layman's reactions to that argument, that the fires were smothered, or not even smothered, but that they were covered, and it trapped the heat. That caused the steel to melt if there was any melted steel. That's what Sunder said.
My initial reaction to that was unbelievable, and and I think he was also talking about that this applies to Building 7, where no planes hit it and there was no jet fuel. So it was these office fires that eventually helped the building collapse, and then the steel goes on the ground, goes underground, and then it gets hot enough to melt it. I mean, that really sounded really unbelievable to me. And, I would sort of like to give an analogy like a kiln. where you put your sculptures in or your clay pots or whatever. But kilns, do heat up and they get hotter and hotter. But kilns are also fed by oxygen. And when you're underground, if you have an underground fire, I don't think it's going to get hotter. At least that's my opinion. Again, I'm not a physicist, but it's not going to get hotter unless there's an active source of oxygen feeding it. And normally when you see a fire underground, you're going to see a lot of black smoke, and that would represent the fire getting colder and colder. So it's not going to get hotter, it's going to get colder and colder. And then why a lot of fires are put out by earth. If you don't have any water available, you just shovel earth on it, and the fire will go out. So it doesn't get hotter when after you put earth on it, it gets colder and dies. So that, it made no sense to me. I think he just threw that out because, that was some kind of explanation that maybe a lot of people would believe. I think it's totally unbelievable.
Well, and that's the problem, and I highlighted this last week on the show when I talked about your interview with Mr. Sunder, that, again, it did. It felt like he was throwing something out there, which is fine if you're talking to somebody in the bar and they're guessing, their guess is as good as yours type of situation. But this is the guy that was put in charge of the investigation from NIST. You can't just be throwing stuff out there. You can't just be dismissing accounts, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I think about that and talk about covering a fire. I mean, you cover a fire, that's the way to put it out. You put something on top of it. Even if you want to say that it got hotter because it was covered, which I still don't really fully believe because of what Allan just said. It seems like it would be oxygen starved, but regardless, it's not going to get hot enough to actually melt the steel to liquefy it. He actually cited during the interview the South Tower, which had molten metal streaming from it. It was orange. He claimed it was silver. So it wasn't just at ground zero. It was taking place during the collapse events. Of course, the technical briefing that day was about Building 7. But no, I don't buy that either. And I've never heard any other quote-unquote debunker say that before. And so if you're just going to throw stuff out, I mean, you got to look into it. You can't just throw it out there when you're the director of NIST. You have to account for these things.
But you got to remember that the only thing that Sunder admitted to in terms of molten metal was that metal that fell out of the South Tower. He did not admit that there was any molten steel in the ground at all during the interview. If you listen to it carefully.
Right, that's an important thing to qualify too. And NIST has never admitted that.
Right, and all of the people that I mentioned during the interview that had noticed that there was molten steel, they refused the interview as it was irrelevant. Okay. So, and he goes back to this with this. The whole thing with NIST is that it goes back to the whole thing was set up from the Congress. The Congress set their charter for NIST's interview. That's what they're following. NIST is following. Sunder is following to determine the cause, not to assign any blame, and determine the technical aspects. So, and then. Sunder and all the other guys at NIST, they came up with this thing. Well, we have to find a credible hypothesis. What is a credible hypothesis? We're going to determine what a credible hypothesis is, and then we're not going to investigate anything else besides that. And we're going to look at evidence that supports our credible hypothesis. And he actually said that there were 3 hypotheses that they thought might be credible: diesel fuel from the tank under the building, the trusses, the main support trusses, and possibly controlled demolition. But then he dismisses controlled demolition almost immediately by saying there was no sound. People would have heard it out on the street. And of course, it wasn't possible because how could they plant those explosives? So that dismissed that one. And the diesel fuel one, I think, was actually dismissed a couple of years earlier. So then they went down to the trusses. So anything else that that I had mentioned in the interview about interviewing Larry Silverstein, interviewing all of the controlled demolition experts, all of those were determined to be irrelevant because they weren't credible controlled demolition, according to them, was not a credible hypothesis because there were no sounds and it wasn't possible to do it. So they left them with a trusses, and that was it. And that's basically how it all ended, and that's how they can justify it.
Well, and the thing about the sound is they based it on a straw man argument. I actually read directly from Beyond Misinformation last week. I think it's page number 39. Audience can download a copy, buy a copy, and read it themselves. But they based it on the notion that RDX was used, even though the working theory based on the evidence was that this was some kind of super thermite that was used, and there is patented technology for thermite cutter charges that exist.
Right, and that would be silent.
And so it wouldn't be as loud as RDX. So yeah, you premise your whole argument on something that is not even your adversary's argument. That's called a straw man argument, and that's how they dismissed it.
This even gets more interesting. You know, I was just reading an article by Kevin Ryan, who wrote this in July 2nd of 2008, and he has in here are the top 10 reasons why nanothermites and nanothermite coating should have come to mind quickly for the NIST WTC investigators. NIST was working with LLNO, I guess that's Lawrence Laboratory, to test and characterize these soil nanothermites as early as 1999, so they're very familiar with this. Foreman Williams, the lead industry on NIST advisory committee, was an expert in this stuff. Science Application International, Homeland Security contractor that supplied the largest contingent of non-governmental investigators to the NIST investigation, has extensive links to nanothermites. Arden Bennett, the meteorologist and expert on fuels and materials, was nominated as director by NIST by George W. Bush, was a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and of course the Department of Defense and DARPA are both leaders in the production and use of nanothermites. And then there's 6 more things which show that NIST itself, and probably Dr. Sunder himself, was very familiar with nanothermites. And the fact that this was brought up, that thermite was brought up as a possible cause, they knew that, but they didn't want to test for it. According to the NFPA 921, which I brought up in the interview, that they should have tested for anything that was a possible cause of ignition. And the fact that they were familiar with nanothermites, well, why didn't they test for it then? And there was evidence that there was nanothermites or thermites. So, these guys knew, in my opinion, again, not talking for No Lies Foundation, but these guys knew that they were very familiar with nanothermites, and they knew that they should have tested for it, and the law said they should have tested for it.
Well, just the notion that they're starting off with to say that a controlled demolition is so off base, so ridiculous, that even just focusing on the straw man argument is just a concession to the wacky conspiracy people. That's the way they treat it. Might talk about RDX. But you have an unprecedented event here. By their logic, it's like finding a body with the head chopped off somewhere and not considering murder, when that is probably one of the most likely reasons that happened. Not even to look at it. Again, this is something that never happened before in history. Forget the Twin Towers for just a minute, because people always say, oh, a plane hit them. So we want to talk about that. We're going to talk about Building 7. No plane hit Building 7. They admit, right in their own report, that the minor damage to the building on the opposite side of the building, where they say the collapse initiated, had nothing to do with starting this building's 7-second symmetrical descent. They blame it all on thermal expansion. All right, so by their logic, as I state every week religiously on this show, all right, by their logic, a few thermally expanding beams from some very fightable fires can cause the whole steel frame high-rise to fall in 7 seconds. Firefighters, if they were battling those fires, would be in danger. So they've created a new safety hazard on the show by that logic. But to start off with this premise that controlled demolition is ruled out, when actually it would be the most likely hypothesis, to quote Lynn Margolis, is bad science. I mean, to not simply rule it out and refuse to look into this, and he even said at the end of the interview he wouldn't even talk to, once the time for public comment is closed, he won't even talk to other people questioning their official reports about this matter. That shows that they have no interest in actually arriving at the truth. They have an interest only in pushing a particular hypothesis and putting on blinders to anything else.
Right. And the other thing is that they set the whole thing up so that they wouldn't investigate witnesses. And in fact, he said during the interview that they interviewed over 1,000 people. 1,000 people. But they all signed non-disclosure agreements, so we couldn't tell you who they are and what they said. Okay. And well, now why did they interview some of the controlled demolition witnesses then if they interviewed those 1,000? They cherry picked who they were going to interview, and they didn't want to interview the people that would give them any kind of evidence that would counter their theories. Is basically what happened.
And I don't understand this whole notion of not disclosing the identities. Now, maybe there's someone out there in science that can step forward and explain this to me, but they're treating it like it's some kind of mob investigation where they have to have people not identify themselves and essentially stay hidden in shadows while they're giving their testimony. I don't get that.
I'd like to see what the non-disclosure agreement said. They may have been done under national security statements. In other words, if you disclose what you said here, you go to jail. That would be very interesting to see what one of those non-disclosure agreements said. They may have done the whole thing under national security, is what I'm thinking right now. There's something else here that I wanted to mention that I talked about foreknowledge. Okay, how did the BBC know? There was a countdown on the street. Okay. He didn't really go into that. He just said that some unknown technical expert that he didn't want to disclose, okay, because of the non-disclosure agreements, or maybe they didn't even know who they were or didn't follow up to find out who it was, said that there was fire and creaking noises in Building 7. So they concluded from that it's going to collapse. Pulled the firefighters out at 2:30 and at 5:20. It collapses. But they never answered the question, how did the firefighters out there on the street and do a countdown just before the building was collapsed? How did they know when it was going to collapse? Did they have some kind of predictive ability? Unless they already knew that there was a controlled demolition in process and it was going to collapse then.
Well, and they'll probably counter and say, oh, that guy misheard or he didn't really hear a countdown, but it's something you should take into account. It's one of those eyewitness testimonies that should be taken into the record and considered. What gets me about this, and I got the impression that Sunder didn't even know who this unknown engineer that's supposedly advising the fire department that the building is going to come down is. Maybe they knew and they won't disclose it, but regardless, why would this be a secret, and why would you not have any interest if they don't know who it is and who this person is? It seems like if you're trying to make this case that the building was going to collapse because the fires were so bad, even though the fires were burned out in the area of collapse initiation an hour before the building came down. But if you're trying to push this story, why would you not want to identify this person and put him right out there? Get him in those History Channel documentaries and say, this guy was there, he made that assessment, and here is why.
He would have been their foremost witness. Their best witness to their story.
Well, yeah, instead they're relying on experts to stand there and watch a video and say what they think might have happened and stare at their computer models that don't look like the actual collapse when you compare them, and they won't release the input data on, and they're relying on people to make these after-the-fact guesses and assessments, but a guy standing there on the street who supposedly was making this, giving this advice to the fire department would be a great witness to bring forward. It's the lack of identification of this person after all of these years that's really makes me wary of that story or who that is. But that's not real science when you're not disclosing this stuff.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that was not brought up during the interview, which and I thought about after I was listening to it today, was that he said that these buildings were not designed for terrorist events. No one even think of that. Okay. However, the World Trade Center buildings were designed to be hit by airplanes. So they didn't mention that. And the actual World Trade Center tower buildings were actually hit by a terrorist event, which was conducted by the FBI in 1993 with a bomb in the basement. It looked like it withstood that terrorist event, FBI terrorist event. So the buildings were designed for terrorist events.
Well, there was an information panel. This is right on one of those British newspapers. I want to say, I think it's the Telegraph. It might be a different one, but I think it's the Telegraph off the top of my head, that talked right on the day of 9/11 about an information panel in one of the towers saying, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, don't worry if an airplane hits this building, it's built to withstand it. And it's kind of amusing, if it wasn't such a grave day in American history. It's kind of amusing to watch this article try to sort that out from the fact that they watched the building come down and come up with some explanation that doesn't sound like there were explosives in the building. But again, all these arguments about terrorist events and it's not ready for it, that only can be thrown at the Twin Towers issue. Building 7 was not hit by an airplane, okay? And again, this is admitted that the minor damage on the opposite side of where the collapse supposedly initiated had nothing to do with bringing this building down. So really we're talking about a fire. Now, a fire is a fire. Whether a terrorist lights it up or it happens spontaneously, a fire is a fire. And you cannot say steel frame high-rises are not built to withstand a fire, all right? Because obviously they are. And we have many examples from all over the world, including the United States, of these buildings.
Yeah, but that's exactly what he's saying, is that the fires can bring them down. That's why at the end I said that, if people are in buildings like this, they should get out within 10 seconds if there's a minor office fire. And, the firefighters shouldn't fight them because the buildings could collapse on them. So he knew that this is all bogus, and the buildings don't come down by fire. And so this begs the question, what kind of recommendations does NIST make in their report for the new construction of buildings to prevent office fires from collapsing them? Do you know? I don't know. Maybe Richard will know.
I don't know either, but I heard a speech by Silverstein talking about the new Building 7. I believe he talked about how they took into consideration what happened before. Well, what are you preventing from happening now? I'd like to hear that. What did they take into consideration from the fall of the first Building 7 to prevent that from happening again? What, you're just going to make sure no fire ever breaks out in it? What could you possibly do, and what have they done? I don't believe, I would have to look into that a little bit more, but I don't believe that anything really major has been done as a result of this new reality that NIST has created for us. And Brian Maxwell, the Scottish firefighter, we interviewed him here on the show a month ago, has a term for it. It's called sudden building collapse syndrome. It's a new phenomenon in the 21st century. They say 9/11 changed everything. I guess this is one of the things that it changed, is that the laws of physics don't apply, and you can now also, all these standards of building construction and the sturdiness of steel frame high-rises is now in question because a few thermally expanding beams framing into a girder in one corner of the building can cause the whole thing to come straight down symmetrically and all the core columns to be cut.
But that's my question. What did that was their job by Congress. What did they propose to change in building standards that would prevent normal office fires from collapsing them suddenly? This could be a good program that you could do. What happened? Call up Sunder tomorrow and ask him.
I would like to talk to a congressman about that. I'd like to say, look, okay, I believe the official story now. I'm waving the white flag. So now what are we going to do to keep the buildings from falling down in 7 seconds? I might want to work in one someday. I don't believe the official story, but if I said that to a congressman, what would they offer me other than platitudes about how 9/11 was a dark day for America?
Yeah, but the point is that NIST's job by Congress was to propose standards that prevent normal office fires from collapsing buildings suddenly. What did they propose? What changes have been made to building standards? Are buildings in San Francisco being built according to new standards to prevent normal office fires from collapsing them? I doubt it. I bet they're using the same standards as before.
Well, honestly, I mean, this is my own personal assessment. I think that this just provided a cover. And what's funny is Congress people don't even use the NIST reports to try to dodge questions about 9/11 and the impossibility of the official stories of what happened to the buildings. They cite the 9/11 Commission, which really didn't get into that. So that's kind of funny that they basically wasted everybody's time. For models they won't disclose. And again, Richard Gage said it when he was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, them keeping the input data secret on Building 7, citing that it would jeopardize public safety if they did it, actually makes people less safe because the architects and engineers coming up need to study this to keep it from happening again. I mean, what do you think about the fact, Allan, that a lot of architects and engineers have never even heard of this third building before? I mean, it should be the most studied thing.
I think I studied psychology in college. It's cognitive dissonance. You don't want most people. Well, number one, if you have a so-called terrorist event, this was a false flag terrorist event, 9/11. But regardless, the effect on the populace is the same. It puts the populace into fear and gives them PTSD. So I think that after 9/11, probably 3/4 of America had PTSD. And when you have that, everybody just rallies around the flag. They don't want to hear anything negative about what the government said, And the way that works is because there's a tremendous emotional response to 9/11. If you can capture somebody's emotion and put them into fear, at that point they will believe anything you say, any lies that you give them. And that's why maybe it was even affecting Sunder too. He just declined to look at any evidence that would be contrary to what the conclusions that he wanted to draw, because of cognitive dissonance and just generalized fear. And I think the same thing is true today. A lot of people would disagree with this, but I think the false flags are continuing since 9/11, and they haven't stopped. I mean, the first one after 9/11 was the anthrax attack. That was clearly a false flag done by the government. The anthrax was government-issued anthrax, and what happened there? It was sent to congressmen. And it was sent to the congressmen that were opposed to the Patriot Act. And immediately after the anthrax was sent, the Patriot Act was signed. Now that probably made the congressmen very fearful for their lives, and they felt that we're going to be attacked if we don't vote for the Patriot Act, and that's exactly what happened.
And I'll add another dimension to this too, is like with Sunder talking about PTSD on the general public. I mean, the other dimension is just that people generally don't tend to question their employers. I saw this when I worked for an insurance company. I won't mention the name, but I would have to defend things on the phone that I thought were really iffy or really kind of cheap and were screwing some people. But, you do it because that's your paycheck and you sort of justify it, and people don't think beyond that. That's what I like about my job now, is I obviously am in line and agree with everything that I'm doing because it is the truth and all of that. So it's cool to do something that you believe in and get out of those kinds of jobs where you're pushing something you don't. But I think that just goes on too. Most people don't do anything they'd rather not do unless they're afraid of something else. And the path of least resistance is to go along and believe the nonsense.
And what happens if you go against the official story? What happened to Kevin Ryan?
Well, exactly.
He came out with the wrong conclusion about the building's collapse, and he was fired. So, and a lot of other people have lost their jobs over 9/11, or were put out to pasture like Stephen Jones. So I think that it's and everybody knows that too. If you're working for a big agency like NIST, and that Congress really wants you to come up with certain conclusions as to what happened and not to go into areas that they don't want discussed. You go along because you know that you lose your job and you're not going to get any advancement in your career. So I mean that could be the whole thing right there. In addition to, the fear that was set up on this thing, I think that people get blindsided, and that's why, even today, fear works. False flags works. This is my conclusion. If the government can do a false flag on the people in order to get something like the Patriot Act passed or to start wars in the Middle East, that's what I believe 9/11 was, then it works. And that they can accomplish things very, very quickly by doing a simple false flag. Maybe it'll only cost them a couple $100,000 to do it. And they do it, and they can change the whole political system of the United States. They can cause wars. They can cause collapses of economies. They can cause people to go to jail. It's a very efficient means of controlling the public.
Well, yeah, and again, who at that time wanted to believe something like that? I've recalled the story of somebody from another country who I'd met over the summer sending me a forwarded email of some American military guy saying there were bombs in the buildings and there's more to this, and I just politely deleted it thinking, oh my God, this stuff is starting already. Kind of patronizing it, looking down on it, not even thinking about it for several years afterwards. That's kind of where people were at.
Tell me about that. I didn't hear that.
Okay. Well, I've told the story on the show before. I'd spent the summer in China. Before that, as a teacher in my last semester of college English, and I had a special friend from Taiwan. She had gone home earlier than me, and by the time I got back to America, we were talking still on email. And she had sent me a email a few days after 9/11. It was forwarded from an American teacher that was probably a little bit more along your line of thinking at that time, Allan. I've already woken up to some of the stuff, and it was some radio broadcast of some military guy saying there had to be explosives in the buildings, and we're being lied to about this, and I don't remember who it was. I can't really recall everything that was said, just the gist of it, because I didn't realize that I was getting some someday life-changing information at that time. I just sort of read the beginning of it and thought, here we go with this stuff already. Wow, they're not wasting any time, and politely deleted it. And I think that's where a lot of mainstream America was at that point. We were trained to laugh at people talking about very obvious truths.
And you know how all that started. It's the conspiracy theory. Your story is like right after 9/11 you got this email, right?
Yeah, within a few days.
Okay. So, and what happened after the Kennedy assassination, and this has all been proven, is that the CIA put out the word to all of their assets working in the media. Some member of the CIA, I can't remember who it was, say that we control the media. They actually have people working in the media for them, okay, or they're on their side, okay. And so they put out the word after the JFK assassination that people like Mark Lane, the guy that I went to see in San Francisco that changed my attitude towards government, that those people should not be believed, that they are conspiracy theorists. And so that's how the conspiracy theorists came up. It was all created by the CIA in order to discredit anybody that would attack the official story, whether it's the JFK assassination or 9/11 or any other false flag that have been occurring since 9/11, since the JFK assassination. So and I think maybe that have been the way that you reacted too. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist. So, or even think about it, or you think about it unconsciously that that people are going to call you a conspiracy theorist even if you entertain these ideas. Even if and you won't investigate any further.
Well, I'll tell you what, back then, at that point, I wasn't even worried about, I'd never really been all that worried about what people think of me. I think my main concern at that point was, it wasn't even a concern. I just figured that people had this handled. I mean, you go to the grocery store and you see all the magazines sitting there and you're like, okay, look at all these magazines, all these writers writing about the news, all these TV networks. Look, there's Dan Rather, there's Tom Brokaw, there's Peter Jennings, there's all these people, cable news, not to mention that. radio, and you have various people who don't like the government and looking out for us. And God, somebody's got to have this covered. There's got to be some kind of truth that's being presented, some kind of consensus. Otherwise, somebody would have caught this. I am not that naive, of course, now, folks. I understand how pretty much everything we watch, read, and listen to in this country is owned by just a handful of companies, and so that lets them be able to kind of set the agenda and base it off of the biases of the people in those ivory towers. But I think the general public isn't really aware of how controlled everything really is, how consolidated everything is. They get this illusion of diversity of information, maybe not so much now, but back at that time, that people just kind of figured this stuff was handled, that someone's looking out for us, and they're not looking to the Richard Gage, who wasn't awoke yet in 2001, but those kinds of people, they weren't looking to that guy, they were looking to the guy who was on TV, because that's why he's getting paid. That's why he's there. They're going to tell us the truth if something's up.
Right. Exactly. And I remember Dan Rather said that it looked like a controlled demolition on the day of 9/11. So, but that all got put under the rug. So the officials, on the day of 9/11, there was a lot of truth that came out, but the day after, all of it was hidden. So, and everybody went along with what the official story was. The media went along with the whole thing at that point.
Well, yeah, and somebody I know made a good point about how this changes your thinking. Again, I thought on that day pretty much people were looking out for us, and if there was anything up, we'd know about it and it'd be somebody else's problem. You come to realize that's not the case when you wake up to 9/11 truth. So this is the fourth dimensional effect of our activism. We make people more guarded. We have people looking at every now news breaking story coming out and looking for problems with the official account, whether there is or there isn't. People are guarded now. They're vigilant to these kinds of things, and they've been fooled once. They don't want to be fooled again. So I think that's a good thing. That's something that we got to keep this movement going for. If we even never get a new investigation, which I think we will if we keep working at it, but even if we didn't, we are still influencing the public. We're still making the world a better place just by constantly shining a spotlight on this issue. And you were talking about how they can just call you a conspiracy theorist. Well, this is why the approach by AE 9/11 Truth is so good, because when you ask them about the new safety issue raised by their theory, calling you a conspiracy theorist is not an adequate answer, even for the layman just watching on the outside. They got to come up with some kind of answer or ignore you and stonewall. And when they do that, you just point to them and it makes the watching public even more suspicious. So by sticking to the science and the hard evidence, you breeze right past that whole finger pointing and name calling game. I mean, they'll still try it, but they'll look more foolish.
Yeah, I think that's actually Richard's doing a great job at that, and that's good. He's one of the forefront of this movement, and it's good that he is sticking to the science of the whole thing. However, we at No Lies Radio, we don't have to do that. So we will investigate anything and everything, and all the current false flags that are going on too. And we actually have a program called False Flag Weekly News every Friday morning at 8:00. It's broadcast live on YouTube and also on No Lies Radio. If you want to see some of the previous editions, just go to our website. You can see that in the archive shows. There's False Flag Weekly News. We also have a lot of other progressive programs that are not so controversial. Of course, we carry your show, Andy, 9/11 Freefall. But we have a daily 9/11 teach-in where we go into a lot of the issues of 9/11. We have another program that comes out of New York, 9/11 Wake-Up Call. We have an anti-war progressive teach-in. We have an economic collapse teach-in, economic update. We have environmental shows, one called Eco Shock. We have science shows, Eco Exploration. We carry Bonnie Faulkner's Guns and Butter. We carry an economic show by Ellen Brown, It's Our Money. And we have we even have the Kevin Barrett show, is another controversial figure. And we carry a Project Censor show, the Project Censor Show. We are looking for volunteers at this point. If anybody wants to volunteer or donate, that would be great. If you want to volunteer, write us at volunteers@noliesradio.org. And again, our website is noliesradio.org. You can find False Flag Weekly News there, or go to YouTube and type in False Flag Weekly News. At least watch it once. You may not agree with it. So, in any event, I don't know what else to say. Andy, do you have anything else that you want to ask me?
All I'm going to say is, obviously we just stick to the science of 9/11 on this show, but people should be questioning everything. I talked about it earlier. I'll say it again. The great thing about what we're doing, we're shining a spotlight on 9/11 and the impossibility of the official story, so it makes people more vigilant on other things. We won't get fooled again, like the song says. And something also I mentioned about No Lies Radio, I love that music that comes on when this show ends, when there's like a few minutes that it hasn't filled, that trippy music. I had a friend listen to the show, and she says, I love that. Where'd you get that music? It's great to end it with that. I'm like, that's not mine. That's No Lies Radio's. That's pretty cool ending. It lets people contemplate and meditate on what they just heard. So kudos to you for putting that on there. On the Sunder interview, just in our last couple of minutes here, what feeling did you come away with? What was your overall impression when you were done with that? Is there anything you would do over again in that interview if you could?
I think we probably covered some of those points tonight. It was my point during that interview was to get through it without him hanging up on me. So. And he was very gracious in actually continuing, even though I hit him with a lot of hardball questions. I probably would have gone more into the foreknowledge and the fact that I mentioned tonight that, well, why did you interview 1,000 witnesses and not the controlled demolition witnesses? I probably should have asked him that question. And more on this his fire underground, how it could have gotten hotter. I mean, I think that's just totally bogus. I should have gone into that more. So.
Say at the Earth's core, it's molten, so maybe that's what he was talking about. I don't know.
Yeah, it was closer to the Earth's core, so that's how it melted.
All right. Well, Allan, Reese, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, listen to No Lies Radio, all the great programming here. Of course, 9/11 Free Fall on every Thursday night. So, but Allan, thanks for hosting the show, on the network, or putting it on there, and hopefully many more good years to follow.
Yeah, one more thing. I'm going to send you the link for the connections between NIST and nanothermites, and we'll put that on the show promo so that people can see that. I think that's important. I mean, NIST was aware of nanothermites.
Absolutely, good idea. Yeah, we will put that in the description, so keep an eye out for that, folks. And again, you can go to noliesradio.org to get that. I'll also link it up at 911freefall.com.
Okay, very good.